All right, I have with me today Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and Marine. Today, we're going to be talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to be talking about China inserting themselves in diplomacy. We're going to be talking about the CIA and several other topics. Scott, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'm going to put your website down below, scottritterextra.com. I'll also put my newsletter and also this month's cash giveaway that my wife and I are doing. But I want to jump right into this. You probably know about this, but new leaked documents this week coming out of Ukraine show Ukraine's generals had planned a middle of the night attack on Moscow to seek revenge on Russia on the 1-year anniversary of them invading Ukraine. It took, from what I'm reading, it took several people at the CIA, the State Department, and possibly even the White House going back and forth trying to convince them that this is going to end in nuclear retaliation or World War III. Were you aware of this attack? And what do you think would have been the outcome if Ukraine had launched this attack on Moscow unbeknownst to NATO?
Well, I wasn't aware of the specifics of the attack until the information came out. I can say that monitoring a variety of Ukrainian Telegram channels and things of that nature, that there had been talk about something like this. And I think it's important for people for people listening to understand that while we talk about a war in Ukraine, this isn't a war. If it was a war, this conflict would be over already. Russia's not at war with Ukraine. Russia is seeking a solution that keeps Ukraine from becoming NATO. War means the destruction of a nation. War means the total defeat of a people. And so I think what the United States and those who intervened were trying to tell the Ukrainians is, if you attack Moscow, there's going to be a war, and all of you are going to die. I just want to point that fact out. If this was a war, Zelensky would not be alive today. He would have been killed in week 1, week 2. If this was a war, Kiev would not exist as it currently exists, with a functioning government, infrastructure, things of that nature. Just ask the Iraqis what happened when we went to war against them. The first places we bombed were presidential palaces, parliament, the functions of government. Leaders became a command and control target, and we hunted them down. Saddam Hussein lived because every day he moved between different targets, different places. We were one step behind him. But I could personally attest, we were trying to kill him. I tried to kill him. One of my missions during the war was to kill Saddam. The Russians are not trying to kill Zelensky. They're letting him live. They're letting the Ukrainian government function because their goal is not the destruction of Ukraine. If the Ukrainians carried out this attack, and look, there's others that they're talking about. Right now, they're talking about sending drones to attack the Victory Day parade on March 9th. If they do this, they will die, literally, because Russia's not at war. But if you attack Moscow in the middle of the night, on the first year anniversary, or on May 9th during the Victory Day parade, that is an act of war, and Russia will respond in the same. They may not use nuclear weapons. In fact, they won't use nuclear weapons against Kiev, but they will take Kiev off the grid. It will no longer exist. And then NATO may get involved, and now we have a nuclear war. So I think that's why the United States came in and did what they did, because the United States, with all the rhetoric that we have here, we understand that Russia is not putting everything on the line here, that this is still very much a limited military operation for Russia, that Russia's goal and objective is not the destruction of the Ukrainian state. If it was, this war would be over. The other problem for the United States is how do you build up a country like we did with Ukraine, elevate Zelensky to be the modern day version of Winston Churchill? I will fight them on the beaches. I will fight them in the shores. I will fight them. And then tell them, well, you can't.
Yeah.
We're going to pretend you're Winston Churchill, but you can't be Winston Churchill because if you do that, you're going to die. And now Zelensky's looking reality in the face. Ukraine has lost the war, and everybody knows it. And so Zelensky's desperate for something that can change the algorithm, change the equation. And I think there's a lot of people surrounding him say that the best way we can survive is to bring NATO into the conflict. And the easiest way to bring NATO into conflict is to go to war against Russia. So, yeah, but I think I'll leave it with this. Dmitry Medvedev, a former Russian president, gave a speech yesterday. And I hope every American watches that speech because there's a lot of talk in the United States about the Russians bluffing. You hear it on the media all the time. Oh, Russia's bluffing about nuclear weapons. They're shaking the nuclear saber, but they're never going to do it. Russia would never do that. And Medvedev said straight up, he said, look, I'm a former president. I will tell you right now that Russia is a nuclear armed nation, and the Russian president, and I was this way, must have a steady hand over the nuclear button, willing to push it at any time that it was required to be pushed. And he said, our doctrine clearly states that if somebody carries out operations that represent an existential threat to Russia, we will use nuclear weapons. And you need to understand there will be no hesitancy, no warning, no discussion, no debate. We will use them. So anybody who sits there and says, well, let Ukraine do this. Why not? It's a suicide pill. And remember, when Russia uses nuclear weapons, it begins what will always end up as a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, and we will all die. So that's why the United States intervenes so hard, because I don't think anybody in the United States in a position of power wants to swallow the Ukrainian suicide pill. And that's what allowed Ukraine to attack Moscow would become.
Okay. Oh, man, interesting. I don't in any way want to defend Putin with what I'm going to say next, but just my observation and my logic seems like he is the more steady hand than Medvedev. I don't speak Russian, but
Medvedev, yeah.
Is Putin good cop and Medvedev the bad cop, or is he just a little bit more wild in his thinking and comments than Putin? Because he's the one that's always like threatening, nuclear war, and Putin's like, okay, hold on, we're just going to keep going with the Russian doctrine.
Look, Medvedev, when he was president, was a very reasonable man. And the reason is, I think the position defines the man. And to be president of Russia is to be president of a world power with tremendous responsibilities. And Putin is a very steady, stable player. Medvedev has a different job today. And see, Medvedev can say things that Putin can't, because it's one thing to have the actual president say something. It's another thing to have somebody on the sideline say something. Medvedev, of course, is very influential. He sits on the National Security Council. He's a close advisor of Vladimir Putin. And so when he speaks from a position of authority, but not the ultimate authority. And so I think Medvedev's job right now, and I think he's relishing this job, is to be that crazy dog in the background, that crazy, snarling, foaming, rabid dog. And Putin's the guy holding the dog by the chain, saying, I don't want to let him go. I really don't want to let him go. Don't make me let him go. So that's his job. But I think if, for instance, Medvedev ever again became president, he would revert to more of a Putin style, because it's the job dictates the attitude, and no president would ever behave that way. It's irresponsible. Medvedev is far removed from the nuclear button, therefore he can make these talks. But remember, he is somebody who was president, and he is not going to be saying these things unless he has a green light from the Kremlin. So I think the Russian president enjoys him saying this because it scares the living you-know-what out of people.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, even just within the last week, President Lukashenko of Belarus said, everybody should still be very worried about nuclear war. Like, this conflict is not behind any of us. And I didn't know if he was maybe posturing on behalf of Putin since they're buddies, or if he's pointing out a truth that this is still something that could very much go sideways. One mistake, an attack in the middle of the night that NATO doesn't have control over, and next thing you know, we're launching, missiles at each other. Is he backing Putin, or is he telling the truth?
Both. It's both. Look, I think a lot of Americans, I mean, I had a conference in my paying job the other day, and I made the reference to the term special military operation. And immediately somebody jumped in and said, well, I don't speak Putin, meaning that simply by using the term special military operation, I was somehow buying into a Russian lexicon and therefore supporting Russian propaganda. And I said, well, that's about the most ignorant thing I've ever heard anybody say, because I'm not speaking Putin either. I'm speaking reality. This was a special military operation, the initial goals and objectives of which were to get Ukraine to the negotiating table, to bring a rapid conclusion to a problem between Ukraine and Russia. And it almost worked. On April 1st, Ukraine was supposed to sit down in Istanbul and sign a peace treaty with Russia, but NATO intervened. And that intervention is everything, because prior to that, this was simply a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And that is not an existential threat to Russia. But when NATO intervenes and turns Ukraine into a proxy of NATO to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia, we have now created an potential existential crisis for Russia. And as Medvedev said, an existential crisis means we use nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. And that's the state we've been in since May, June of 2022. We have been facing the imminent possibility of a nuclear war, because this war is between NATO and Russia. And that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, even though if you're looking at things, it looks like everything's going okay for Russia right now, what happens if Poland intervenes in Western Ukraine? What happens if Latvia and Lithuania decide to embargo Kaliningrad, that Russian enclave on the Baltic Seas? These are acts of war that could get Russia engaged in military conflict with a NATO member. Article 5 then kicks in, and now it's a general war between Russia and NATO, not a de facto war, but a real war, and nuclear weapons will be used. So that's what Lukashenko is saying. He's saying, for all those people in Poland that are meeting with the Ukrainians, talking about erasing the border to create a confederation between Ukraine and Poland, thereby allowing Poland to bring troops in, that will be a nuclear conflict. For all those people in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia who think you can embargo Kaliningrad to punish Russia, that will be a nuclear conflict. That the threat of nuclear war is very real. Remember, he's the president of Belarus, who has now been empowered by Russia. On July, Russia will be storing nuclear weapons on Belarus soil that are going to be turned over to Belarus Air Force and missile forces in case of a war. So Lukashenko is speaking as a potential nuclear leader. So everybody should listen to what he's saying. He's not threatening anybody. He's just stating a straight up fact that things can still go, as you said, sideways. And if they go sideways, nuclear weapons are very much on the table. So I say this not because I want to fearmonger or be seen as supporting Russian policy. I say this as an American who doesn't want to die. And I would hope that everybody listening to this understands that that's what we're talking about. This isn't a game. This is reality. And for Russia, it's life and death reality, just as if a Russian army was in Mexico threatening to empower insurgents in America to strip away Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Maybe even take Colorado and Utah while you're at it. Just carve away all of those former Spanish territories, former Mexican territories, and bring them in. We would view that as an existential threat, and we would use every weapon necessary to prevent that from happening, to include nuclear weapons. That's where Russia is right now, and they're not playing games.
Yeah. I bring this stuff up because I read this but then I go to like CNN and MSNBC and ABC News. They're not talking about the warnings from Lukashenko. They're not talking about the warnings from Medvedev. And that's why I bring these up. And sometimes people are like, well, you're making this stuff up because I'm not seeing it in the mainstream media. But
Yeah.
trusting the mainstream media is